Welcome to Trinity Place in Geneva, New York. My name's Cameron Miller, and this is the third Sunday of Lent. And the gospel appointed for today is the Gospel of John, chapter 4, verses 5 through 42. It's a long one. And here at Trinity Place, if you're watching this as part of the worship video, we are also using a really lovely poem by Mary Oliver entitled Thirst, and that relates to the Old Testament lesson, which I'm not going to talk about. So if you know me, you'll know that I almost never wear a clerical collar, except on Sundays here for worship and at weddings or funerals or going to the hospital, only when it's necessary. But one day in downtown Buffalo, where I used to live and work, I was there at lunch in a restaurant with my collar on. And I was there with a friend of mine, and we were having a very interesting theological conversation with one another when the waiter arrived at our table. "How's it going?" I asked, and but not really wanting to know. "Terrible," he replied. Now, this was a waiter who I knew, sort of. I actually didn't know his name, but I knew him by frequency of visit, and he me. We knew each other's faces. And when asked, he always said, "Terrible." Well, my lunch pal and I laughed, and we bantered with him a little bit. And then he responded tersely with tears in his eyes, "No, I mean it." And he grimaced and walked away, muttering under his breath. After a fair amount of time, our waiter returned, but was just barely composed. He was taking our drink orders when he stopped suddenly, cold. "You're a priest?" "Yes," I smiled. "I didn't know you were a priest." He seemed shocked. "Sure you did. You must have known," I replied. "No, I didn't know," he said with certainty. "I can't believe all the things I have told you all these times you've come in here." And then he added with indignation, "And you're a priest," and walked off. I looked at my lunchmate and wondered, what things? I tried to think of anything I knew about him from whatever he had said to me over the years. I couldn't think of anything he ever told me incriminating. Well, he brought our drinks to us in tears, sort of streaming down his face, and he says, "I need to talk to you. I can't believe you walked in here today of all days. I need to talk to you." "Okay," I replied. "After lunch, I'll stay and we can talk. Does that work?" And the waiter agreed and walked off. My lunch partner, who was also in the helping professions, we gave each other a kind of knowing glance, and then we just kept talking about whatever it was we were talking about. Then after lunch, the waiter took me into a back room, and we sat down across the table from one another. Tears dripping down his cheeks, he asked me, "Am I going to hell? Am I going to hell?" Honestly, a part of me wanted to laugh. Not at him or at his obvious pain, but at the situation. It's like, I don't even believe in hell. But I'm also wise enough to know that not speaking with authority about things, I'm wise enough to know not to speak with authority about things that nobody knows about. So here I am in the back room of this restaurant, facing somebody who's sobbing, apparently afraid he's going to hell, and I'm supposed to know the answer to that? I waited a long time to answer, probably too long, because he said, "You know I'm gay, right?" "Yes," I answered without hesitation. "So am I going to hell?" Let me get this right. You're afraid you're going to hell for being gay, I asked. "Yes, it's who I am. Am I going to hell?" "Being gay is who you are," I replied and confirmed. "Yes," he said, still crying. Now, this was not a young man. He'd lived some years, I would say he'd lived some hard years, maybe into his 40s. "Why are you thinking about death?" I asked. And then he told me about 3 members of his family, all who had died around his age, from a variety of ailments, from heart attack to stroke. So you're gay, and that's who you are. And you want to know if God loves who you are or rejects who you are, I asked. Yes. Am I going to hell? He asked again, staring at me across the table through reddened eyes. If you were here last week, or heard last week's sermon, you heard a story about a man named Nicodemus, a hoity-toity religious authority. And he went by night, the cover of night, to meet Jesus in person. Now, it's often construed that Nicodemus, as a religious authority, didn't want his colleagues to see him hanging out with a renegade preacher. But the conversation didn't go very well, and Nicodemus left confused, if not disappointed, because he simply just didn't get Jesus. Now, I believe the author of the Gospel of John, who told that story about Nicodemus, as well as the one today about the woman at the well, wanted us to make a connection between Nicodemus and the woman at the well. The Samaritan woman, as far as most of Jesus' peers were concerned, whether his disciples or groupies or interested bystanders, would have considered her filth. She was dirt. The Jews from Judea and Galilee considered Samaritans more or less untouchable. Never mind why, because you and I have enough of our own prejudices to know that such things exist. But trust me, the Samaritans were considered to be on the other side of anything good. In contrast to Nicodemus, who was the epitome of moral rectitude, the Samaritan woman encountered Jesus at high noon in the light. When she did, she got him almost immediately. She understood who and what he was intuitively and even explicitly. And if that wasn't contrast enough, she then went and told her family and friends all about Jesus. Now that contrast couldn't be more blatant between Nicodemus and the woman at the well. It's just one more gospel example that those who are considered good and wise must sneak around in the dark in search of the light, while those considered wretched, stupid, or immoral seek out the light where it shines. I don't know if this is true or not, but it is a gospel truth that the socially acceptable and publicly esteemed have greater difficulty in comprehending God. But those who are socially marginal and most often discounted are capable of great clarity about God. That's how it's represented in the Gospels. The contrast between Nicodemus and the woman at the well reinforced the gospel perspective that those who should know about Jesus are blinded, while those who are expected to be blind somehow seem most open to Jesus. Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman occupied polar opposite ends of the social and religious spectrum. His name was preserved, and we never knew hers. So one of the things we need to ask ourselves when we hear a story like this is why was it told? Why this story? Why was the story of the Samaritan woman ever told? What does it tell us? And what does it explain that someone living back then might have been asking? Now, one clue might be in the way that Jesus' best and brightest students were flabbergasted by his boundary dancing with a stranger whose ethnicity and gender made her untouchable. Literally, do not touch. It makes me wonder if perhaps, just maybe, there were some Samaritans who were part of Jesus' crowd of followers. Maybe people wanted to know how it came to pass that Jesus had Samaritan followers. Or even that long after his death, when John was writing his little book about Jesus, that maybe there were still some Jewish Christians who could remember why Samaritans were supposed to be untouchable. And seeing them in the crowd at church, they might have asked out loud, why are Samaritans here allowed at our table? So maybe the story of the woman at the well explains how it came to be that Jesus had Samaritan followers. It was because, they would have told people, she went out with great excitement and passion and told all her friends all about what she had encountered. And then in turn, they invited Jesus to hang out. And surely some of those Samaritans left with Jesus after the visit, because Jesus seems to have picked up people along the way like that. But there is another dimension to this story that we want to pay attention to. Now, John is a pretty lengthy gospel. It's the longest gospel by far. And he could have placed the woman at the well anywhere in all of the gospel that he wanted to, or not included it at all. But he put it next to Nicodemus so that John wants us to know something in particular. John wants us to know that Jesus was not in the purity business. Jesus didn't give a damn about religious purity. And he was in their faces all about that as often as he could be. Now the problem, of course, is that the church became a purity business, just like the temple that Jesus was trying to reform. Christianity became a purity religion, just like the religion that Jesus was trying to reform. So let's ask ourselves, why would Jesus take the risk of alienating so many of his own peers and colleagues by living among and sharing table with Samaritans? Why would Jesus be so willing to alienate so many of the very people he was struggling to influence and reform in the first place? Excuse me. It seems pretty clear to me. It was because this radical hospitality he modeled, that he enacted, that he embodied, was not a sideline. It was the main event. This radical hospitality that Jesus offered was not an incidental footnote to some bigger, greater theological truth. This radical hospitality that Jesus embodied was the very substance of his witness. Christianity should not be focused on who is having sex with whom. Christianity should not be focused on whether or not we get to choose our gender. Christianity should not be focused on preventing and punishing immigrants. Christianity should not be focused on defeating Islam or proving that we have the truth and all other religions don't. Christianity should not be focused on how many times, in how many ways we're born. Christianity should not be focused on moral and theological purity of any kind. Any kind. Rather, Christianity should be focused. It should be focused on inclusion, not as a sideline, not as an afterthought, not as an incidental element of the mission, but as the mission. That is our mission. So, there we sat, me and the waiter, whose name I didn't know, in the shadows of an unfamiliar back room of a restaurant, perched on a painful question. Now, I knew in my heart of hearts that it did not matter what I thought. It only mattered what he thought. Because in the end, what I happen to think about heaven and hell or anything else could not change that man's pain. I try to tell younger clergy and preachers, new preachers especially, that we have no authority, if ever we did. And no one thinks that a priest knows something that they don't know. And if they do, they will only go along with it so long as it reinforces what they wanted to think in the first place. So I knew that no matter what I said, this poor man was going to have to find his own way back across the border of untouchable. In his own heart, and through hearing the voice of God in his own mind, not what I said. Am I going to hell for who I am? He insisted on knowing. No, I said, as if I'm used to speaking for God. If being gay is who you are, then why would God reject who you are? As I understand it, our task is to become more and more and more of who we actually are, rather than less and less. So sitting there, looking him in the eyes, I did something a little strange. I apologized to him for the church. I apologized to him as if I had the authority to do so, for the whole history of religious bigotry toward homosexuality. I apologize to him for the church's moral failure and for our dragging Jesus and the Gospels through the mud of bigotry instead of the light and love of God. I assured him he wasn't going to hell, but also told him that he had work to do. He needed to get comfortable with the idea of death. And that, in the end, is his toughest issue, was whether he was going to trust God or not. Because it all comes down, I said, to whether we are going to trust God to love us or not. And this is what I would say today. Nobody can tell us a dang thing of value about God if we don't first trust God ourselves. Whatever else we think, right or wrong, good or bad, whatever else we think we know, either we trust God to love us just as we are, or we live as untouchables within and among ourselves. Jesus wants us at the table. All of us, to come as who we are. Thanks for being here. Peace be with you.